Hello, everyone. GM. Welcome back to another episode of Overpriced JPEGs. I am so excited for this episode. I say this for every episode, but sometimes I mean it more than others, and I could not mean it more for this particular episode. Today, I am joined by Tim Ferriss. I imagine the majority of you know who Tim Ferriss is. 5 times New York Times bestselling author, host of The Tim Ferriss Show, which has had nearly 1 billion downloads, which is absolutely mind-boggling. Early investor in Uber and Twitter and Facebook. Maybe we'll get your thoughts on some of the Twitter stuff later if you're game. Not the focus of this podcast. And of course, now the creator and founder behind COCKPUNCH NFTs, cockpunch.com.
Everything led here.
The Legend of COCKPUNCH.
What a situation. Yes, indeed.
We'll talk about where the name came from as well, because obviously that caught some attention. But I think it's really fun. And for folks who haven't listened to the Emergent long fiction podcast you've been releasing, the way you do the intro to that podcast and have the little cockpunch.com at the end is very fun and worth listening to just for that.
I encourage people to listen to the trailer. It's like 50 seconds long.
It's worth it. Great. And so we're going to get into all that. The NFT project. I'm also going to sneak in some like podcasting media questions selfishly because I've admired how you do what you do for a long time. But before we get into all that, need to hear from our lovely sponsor, Ledger. Have you gotten your Ledger STAX wallet yet, Tim?
STAX, we'll see. I mean, I have multiple ledgers.
We'll send you the overpriced JPEGs link. And, if you want to buy a Ledger STAX, you can use that link to go onto Ledger and pre-order it now.
Special price for me. I'm on it.
Do y'all realize what's happening over at Ledger? That the #1 leader in digital asset security has teamed up with Tony Fadell, builder of the iPod, to revolutionize the experience of owning digital assets securely. They're doing this with Ledger STAX. This is the most premium product to date, and it's so user-friendly. Ledger STAX is a palm-sized device with a new e-Ink 2 display on the cover and around the spine, meaning you can view and confirm transactions at a glance. You can also customize your Ledger by displaying your favorite NFT on the cover, even when the device is off. Pair your new Ledger STAX with your Ledger Live to manage, earn, and hodl all your NFTs and over 500 coins. This space needs sleek user experiences, our iPod moment, and that's what Ledger has set out to do here without compromising their core promise of security. Keep your digital assets in the safest place they can be, a Ledger STAX wallet. Trust yourself with Ledger STAX and go to shop.ledger.com to pre-order your Ledger STAX now. They're shipping in April. And if you use the link in our show notes to pre-order now, you'll be helping the show as well. Thank you. Okay, so I was trying to figure out how to kick off a podcast with you, which is very intimidating because you are the king of podcasting. And I felt like maybe there are some folks in my audience who aren't really familiar with you and your work. How do we summarize like Tim Ferriss in an intro section relatively quickly so that we can get on to what you're doing with NFTs and all this other stuff? And conveniently, you provided me with, I think, like the perfect opening anecdote to do a little bit of background and get people familiar with who you are. And that is like the night before like Christmas Eve, I think, or like on Christmas Eve, I get an email from you, and you and I don't really know each other. We've corresponded over email, telling me that I have a typo on the Overpriced Gin website. And first of all, I was so grateful for this. I was like, this is so gracious. Thank you. I'm always the person looking at websites being like, oh, they have 2 extra spaces there. Somebody should tell them, whatever. So first of all, I was so appreciative. But I also was like, who is this man? Like, millions of dollars in podcasting, like just like such a celebrity in my world. And he's emailing me to be like, oh, you missed the word "to" on this website. But it also fits so beautifully with my like understanding and impression of you, which is just as such an incredibly methodical person, so detail oriented. I think that'll certainly come up as we talk about COCKPUNCH and you flesh this out to anybody who's still unfamiliar with it. Yeah. And so I'm curious for you, like how innate is that detail orientation? How learned is it? And would you be able to rank it in like the traits that you feel like have made you super successful? Where would you sort of rank that just incredible methodical thing you seem to have?
Yeah, so I will answer that. Let me mention first that we were in touch. So it wasn't out of the blue.
No, it was not out of the blue, which by the way would have made my life in either case. But
yeah. So let me give a bit of context for that. So you had launched this drink, this adult beverage, and I'm interested in that as a category to begin with. And so I started going down the rabbit hole, and I was looking at your Twitter account because I wanted to be familiar with what was current for you before we spoke today. And went through a few clicks, found the typo. And my feeling was, if I were in your shoes, I would want somebody to tell me there was a missing preposition.
100%.
Because at least the way I operate is, my assumption is, broadly speaking, the way you do anything is how you do everything. So I wouldn't want someone to assume that you weren't minding the details on the product because there was a missing word in a paragraph on a website that was kind of the leading paragraph in a sense. So I wanted to provide that feedback. And you took it very graciously, which some people do. A lot of people don't. You know, if they have broccoli in their teeth, they don't want you to tell them. If they are trying to learn a foreign language and they're screwing something up over and over again, they don't want the feedback. They just want the positive feedback. And that's just not how I operate. I feel, and this is not accurate, but my general worldview is, again, I'm not saying this is accurate, but my long-term belief has been the good stuff by and large takes care of itself, but you do need to mind some of these details, especially because if you're hiring people, they can snowball into cultural norms. So I pay a lot of attention to the question of how innate that is versus trained. I think the visual acuity is largely innate. I mean, I've had 2010 vision for as long as I can remember. Even at my age, still I have 2010, and I notice things like that. I can scan through a document really quickly, and if there's a missing word or a missing piece of punctuation, I'll catch things that lawyers miss. So that is innate, but it's also very, very, very heavily trained, I think, through the craft of writing. And since I started as a nonfiction, well, to the extent that I started as anything that then put me in the public eye, it was as a nonfiction writer. And then that took me through 5 books, and the podcast came about after book 3. So I do have an eye for detail. And I would say that probably, if you want me to give a quick background for people who don't know, since you'd mentioned that as well, I would say I'll give the few paragraph summary, which is, wanted to be a comic book penciler for almost all of my childhood, moved then to focus on neuroscience, was very interested in science, decided that animal testing wasn't for me at the time. I do think it has a role, but at the time couldn't do it, and moved into East Asian studies, which does require a lot of attention to visual specifics for writing systems. Silicon Valley, startup. That startup fails that I was working for, start my own startup, burn out, start gathering notes, teach a class. That turns into the 4-hour work week. 4-hour work week becomes this unexpected bestseller. That turns me into an author, which I was never planning on. 5 books later, which were all either #1 New York Times or Wall Street Journal or both. Here we are. And in the process, along the way, met people who were willing and generous enough to teach me about angel investing, podcasting. So I jumped in with both feet for both of those. And the most recent series of experiments is in NFTs over the last 2 years or so.
What did you say? Do you ever have the situation? I know you've written about being famous and the process of becoming famous and sort of the status of famous, where like you're famous, you're not Taylor Swift famous, where literally you can't go anywhere. Do you ever encounter people today that's like an Uber driver who doesn't know who you are, and they ask you what you do, and like, what do you say?
All the time.
What do you say?
I mean, I usually will just say, it depends on if I want to talk to them or not.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
If I meet somebody, now in the case of say an Uber driver, I'll just tell them probably a writer or a podcaster.
Yeah.
Maybe podcaster, because I would say in the last 5 years, the majority of people who come up to me and introduce themselves, if they know who I am, the vast majority don't. I don't consider myself a celebrity. I am in the public eye, but compared to any, what I would put in the category of real celebrity, nationally known, 90% of the people in one age demographic are going to know this person.
You're not getting stalked by the paparazzi, right? But like you do have a lot of people
I'm not getting stalked by the paparazzi.
You have a lot of people, millions of people who know who you are and love your work.
Yeah, so there is that. Yeah, there is that. And I would say my answer is generally writer or podcaster. If it is someone at a cocktail party who's like, so what do you do? And I'm like, I don't have any time for this guy. Then I'll be like, yeah, I'm an accountant or an architect. No insult. intended for either of those professions, but usually I'll pick something I think they will have
no interest
in or know nothing about.
Yes.
Therefore, they will have little interest in.
Yeah.
So I pull a George Costanza sometimes.
Oh, my hairdresser thinks I am a marketing at like a tech company. Like I will, or I'll do insurance, you know, similarly, just like, don't ask me any follow-ups. Okay, let's get into Cock Punch here. I don't want to do too much history on Cock Punch. I love that you still laugh every time you hear it. I definitely laughed all the way through your Bankless interview talking about it because it was amazing. But there are you've been on, obviously you do the random show with Kevin Rose, who folks here know. I should have made a joke about that in the beginning. I should have been like, and most importantly to my audience, friend of Kevin Rose.
Friend of Kevin Rose.
You've been on, you and Kevin Rose have talked about it. You've been on Bankless, but you know, we obviously want to give some of the background, and then I really want to talk about where we are now, some of the lore that you started fleshing out. So I guess let's start with just like the first moment or moments that really were when you started to conceptualize Cock Punch, including the name.
Including the name. Yeah. So I think that my general MO is often, or just my kind of default is, if I'm not pushing hard or redlining in a lot of things, not everything, but this is true with sports. This has been true with competition of different types. This has been true with publication of books and aiming for number one. I'm very, very, very competitive. And often that ends up meaning that if I don't feel like I am suffering at least a little bit, I'm not trying hard enough. And I wanted to try to do something that would focus on fun, something that was generative, not in the art block sense, but in the surplus of options, right? Something that is a font and that like a wellspring of new options and new possibilities for me personally. And I wanted to see how elegantly I could explore creative corners that I hadn't explored or that I wanted to resurrect in the case of, say, illustration and so on. But if you take the trailer as an example.
From the director of the 4-Hour Workweek, the producer of Tools of Titans, and the writer of How to Start a War, comes a tale of adventure, intrigue, and ancient mysteries. The Legend of COCKPUNCH.
So that trailer, I mean, literally popped into my head, and I thought, you know what? For something like the Tim Ferriss show, or the podcast, or one of my books, it doesn't necessarily make sense for me to do a comical, farcical, fake movie trailer. But for Cock Punch, I can do anything. Because of the name, first of all, like that buys me permission to do whatever the hell I want in a sense, because I can't take it too seriously, and I encourage no one to take it too seriously. And within that, I have tremendous creative liberties, which is not true for a lot of what I've done in the past. So I know I'm meandering a little bit, but
where should people go to watch the trailer?
If people go to,
what's the best place?
Yeah. I mean, the easiest place to go is just cockpunch.com/podcast. And the first episode of the podcast is a trailer. And that podcast ended up hitting, number one fiction across all of Apple Podcasts globally and did really well. And it's still doing well. But I wanted to do something new with a medium that I had experience with. But where I'm trying to very clumsily get to is that Cock Punch started not with NFTs, not with Web3, but with a desire to take myself less seriously, to be less precious and protective about creative projects. And then I started looking for conditions and technology that would make that most likely and most possible and give me some accountability. And then I started layering in like tech. Okay, if I'm looking for joy and fun and laughter, Kevin Rose is a good place to be. So how might I interact more with Kevin Rose, right? Brendan Mulligan's a good place to be. How do I interact more with Brendan Mulligan? And so the reason I'm mentioning this is it might be helpful for other people. Like, you don't have to start with the what you want to do. You could start with what you want to feel. You could start with who you want to interact with or the types of people you want to interact with, where you want to be. That could be also a corner on the internet. And then work backwards from there. So I had already started with that type of thinking and I was already exploring NFTs. And I thought, well, this is a new sandbox. I like playing in new technological sandboxes. I've been doing that for almost 20 years now. And I guess closer to 15, maybe, since 2007, when the 4 Hour Workweek came out. And then one night in the middle of the night, the name just occurred to me because I'd been thinking about having something involving like roosters and balls and cock and balls. Haha, very funny. But it wasn't interesting past 5 minutes, sort of post laughing at that. And then I started drawing, and I was drawing these characters with gauntlets, and I thought, oh, okay. And then at 3 a.m, it popped in my head, cock punch. That's funny. And at the very least, if this bombs and people want to write about it bombing, they're going to have to write cock punch. And I found that just entertaining. but I really want to drive something home if this is like the only thing that I get across to people, which is how do you create conditions such that you can take what seem to be big risks that are actually very low downside, if that makes any sense. And if you call something like, if someone were to say, we've got this superstar team and we're going to work on a screenplay for a scripted movie with the best director producer for the 4 Hour Workweek, I would be very excited, but I'd also be very nervous because I've never done it before. And I would be extremely concerned about screwing it up or giving up creative control or fill in the blank. What Cock Punch allows me to do is play with 3D modeling, rigging, fiction podcast, voice acting, producing voice actors, working on different types of music and licensing music. I mean, these are all skills that I'm acquiring that are transferable to many, many, many other places. And I'm doing it through the smokescreen of this thing called Cock Punch. And I want to do many experiments like that. And this is a vehicle for doing those experiments. And hopefully that transfers to entertainment for the holders and some type of collaboration with respect to the creative process. And I think the AI art competition that I ran recently would be a good example of that.
I'm going to tell people a little bit about that. Yeah. And what did you learn from that?
Yeah. So there's an amazing artist. You can find her. I think her handle is just at Blockheim, BLOCKHEIM on Twitter, who used the attributes of her particular character, right? Cock puncher. I need to figure out what to call these folks. And ran it through Midjourney with refined prompts because she's very good at using Midjourney, and created these spectacular pieces of art. And I was so impressed by it. And I was also concurrently playing with AI in a number of different tools that I wanted to learn myself how to get better at prompting and using combinations of tools. So I said, fantastic. Inspired by this amazing woman, an artist and designer, I want to launch a competition where people create cock punch based artwork, right? They can either use one of my characters or something they own, but not something that somebody else owns because I don't want to get into IP headaches. And the key here is they can't just offer their end result. They have to capture their process using something like Loom or another program. They have to show their work. That was the key. So if you go look at the tweet thread at T Ferriss, 2 R's, 2 S's, my name, and just walk through the winners, I ended up having many more winners than initially planned. And particularly once I put up a blog post, which I will do shortly, you will save yourself 6 months of screwing around with AI tools. I really feel that way. If you just walk through the process capture in the order that I will lay them out, which will be in some logical sequence. And in putting that together, I will learn how to use these tools. And I feel very, very strongly that this is a tectonic plate shift. You're either going to be a beneficiary of or a victim of AI. So you should learn how to use these tools and start playing with them as quickly as possible, is my feeling.
I was going to save this for later, but we're on it now. Or is there anything else you're playing with? Obviously, like Midjourney, some of these visual art tools. Obviously, ChatGPT is really hopping in right now in terms of writing. There are tools you're really leaning into on the AI side right now?
I'm playing with all of them, and I'm encouraging other people to play with all of them. So another reason that I wanted to do the AI art competition is so that I would basically arm my army, if that makes any sense, right? So if I create a how-to blog post that has a sequence of 10 to 15 process videos, I'm basically providing a free masterclass of sorts on AI for anyone who wants to learn. So my expectation is that'll take my audience from, I mean, who knows how many people actually use these tools really well, maybe a few hundred, to hopefully at least a few thousand, maybe tens of thousands, just given the size of the audience. And that's exciting because then when I do more things later, let's say I do a follow-up competition, well, things will be very, very different. And similarly, if I can, by doing competitions or looking for talent, teach myself, say, the basics of Blender and 3D modeling and rigging, and in so doing, then teach thousands or tens of thousands of people in my audience to do that, things get really, really interesting very, very quickly. And because I know that you mentioned before we started recording that you read my first and my second book, long ago. It's the same shit.
4 Hour Body.
Yeah, 4 hour work week, 4 Hour Body, 4 Hour Chef. It's all the same shit.
Work week, I've read
meaning,
both, yeah.
meaning I'm trying to make myself kind of irrelevant by teaching people skills quickly. It's the same stuff. So I'm taking the same general ethos and approach and doing it here. But yeah, I'm playing with ChatGPT. I think ChatGPT is very underutilized and under refined at the moment. I'm very excited to see what people build on top of it. I do think OpenAI should probably change their name because they're not exactly open.
Yeah. They started open. They started open and then Sam Altman closed it. Anyway. I'm excited for what you put out on that because I have loved learning from you and I'm really trying to dive down the AI rabbit hole. My qualm with ChatGPT is that it was mostly trained on data before 2021, so it doesn't really know that much about like NFT stuff as well. So I'm damn, I can't start any of my NFT articles just with a ChatGPT article that I gussy up, so all coming out of this brain. You're such a track and measure person, which obviously comes out in just even in the way you speak and anybody who's read any of your works. I'm curious what of that you're bringing into this developing of an NFT project, which is more freeform than you sometimes are. And what are you tracking and measuring as part of this process?
Great question. I may have a dissatisfying answer, but I think for some people it will be interesting potentially. And that is, I chose this project so that in the long term, I would not be able to use metrics as a crutch. So I'm very comfortable with measurement. I'm very comfortable with quantitative analysis and all sorts of multivariate testing and so on and so forth. I mean, that's how I came up with the first book title, 4 Hour Work Week, right? It was Google AdWords split testing of all of these different combinations of titles and subtitles. And
it's exhausting. Like, I'm like, I don't understand how your brain works the way it does. But anyways, continue.
Yeah. It can be exhausting for me too. And so the focus on, say, fiction in a sense, and this is very different from, say, sci-fi, right? If you pick sci-fi instead of fantasy, and we can get into the weeds here. Like, there are what you might call hard and soft magic systems and so on and so forth. But by choosing fiction, by choosing fantasy, I'm giving myself the ability to let go of some of these hard measurements and to really indulge some of the softer, squishier crafts, perhaps, that give me, like, feed me and give me energy and give me joy. And I think I've let that atrophy because as someone who's a business person and I'm an investor and I am a serious adult and I do serious work, you can end up boxing yourself into this quantitative prison where if it's not precisely measured, it doesn't matter, or you don't understand what you're talking about. And I think that is a false narrative. Although that phrase is very overused in Web3, I think it's a false construct, I suppose, is what I would say. And there's a lot to be gained from the things that are very difficult or impossible to measure precisely, or you wouldn't want to impose that. So with the NFTs and figuring out the mint price and figuring out supply and figuring out owner mint and looking at secondary and all of the variables that fit into the launch of a project, I was very quantitative, and we analyzed lots of projects, and we looked at many, 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 many things. So there was a front loading of analysis, but at the end of the day, I do not want to become I certainly never want to be a day trader. I certainly don't want to engage with NFTs predominantly through the lens of someone who is studying game theory and just toggling different switches to keep a bunch of traders happy. That's not why I got involved in the first place, which also underscores the importance of starting from like, what do I want to feel from this? Why am I doing this? Right? Because I launched in a bear market. I could have launched far earlier. And I actually could have also pulled the plug. It's not like I have to do an NFT project. There's nothing in my life that compels me to do an NFT project. But I actually was very glad to launch when I did, because the stakes, in a sense, were lowered, not just for me, but for other people, right? Because if the ticket
there's a typo on your landing page, you know.
Yeah.
The entire community might not boycott you the way they may have. I kid. I really did want that fixed.
I will say, like, if I will usually refuse to read books if friends or even acquaintances have them. Almost always I'll refuse because I can't not edit. Like friends of mine have sent me manuscripts and I send them back a fully edited manuscript. Like I can't, it's very hard for me to turn that off, which can drive people fucking bananas, but it's hard for me to turn off. So I usually don't proofread for people, or if they're like, I just want your kind of broad strokes thoughts, which generally means I want you to stroke my ego and tell me it's really good.
Yeah.
Most people who ask for feedback don't want feedback. They want positive reinforcement. And I'm the wrong guy if you're coming to me for that. I will point out what I like, but I will also be like,
yeah,
you have a lot of dangling prepositions and it gets annoying after 5 pages, or whatever.
I can relate to that a bit. I mean, obviously not evidenced by that one paragraph, but okay. You talked about this front loading analysis you did, which I'm really curious about, because how many NFT projects want to know, what should my price be? What did that process look like? Was that super manual, or were you taking in data from pre-mint that pre-mint had, or whatever, and writing some software that's looking at it? Like, what did that look like?
Didn't write software, but it's not accidental that I wanted to do something with Brendan because he's a very old friend and I like working with him, and this was a way to in a way have a reunion with old friends. But so he has broad access across projects. I do this with most things that I do, right? So if I were hypothetically to look at game development, whether it's tabletop or 2D, 3D, any number of different game formats, or toys, or comics, or fill in the blank, I would try to find someone who has a 30,000 foot or maybe a 10,000 foot view across many, many, many projects. Right. So, for instance, in publishing, who's that going to be? Well, an author might only have 5 books. If you talk to that person's agent, though, if they represent a stable of 10 authors, now you've got, I'm just making this up, 50 books. And that person is probably worth a conversation if you can make it worth their time. So it wasn't accidental that I, from a tactical and strategic perspective, I ended up working with Brendan. But I did not write software. I did not use any. There are so many tools out there you can use for looking at rarity tables and so on. I think that a lot of folks get lost in the weeds with NFTs and Web3. I'm just like, for me, I didn't want to go there because that's not my game. Everybody else is going to be, or there will be a lot of people better than that, better at that than me. And so really it was trying to identify any patterns in projects that succeeded and failed. What does that mean, right? Generally, in this capacity, it means sold out, because there's a lot of hurt behavior in NFTs. And if something doesn't sell out, then people are like, it's a failure. And there's not that much independent thinking in Web3 or NFTs. I hate to say
ironic, which is
it
ironic because you see, like, to be into it in and of itself, you're sort of going against conventionality or the mainstream, but then you get here and then you exhibit all the same behaviors of herd mentality.
Yeah, no, it's like if you say you're a contrarian and then you just hang out with a bunch of people who are contrary in the same ways, you're not actually...
You're not a contrarian. You have an ideology.
Yeah, you have an ideology, right? So if you're trying to think from first principles and come to unorthodox conclusions, if you want any kind of competitive advantage, creatively or otherwise, then you have to do that. So for me, very often, I would talk to people about why they thought projects failed or succeeded, and they would make a strong statement. And I would say, like, what evidence do you have to support that? And they would sometimes have a good answer, but most often they would not. And then I would say, well, you just said it's important to do A. Are there any examples of projects that have done negative A, right? The complete opposite, and succeeded. And then they would pull out a couple of examples and I'd be like, okay, I'm just not really going to weight that very heavily. And I'm not a jerk about it. I'm giving a shorthand summary of these conversations. So I think I did a pretty good job of identifying the things that matter and don't matter. And we did constrain supply. Initially, the supply was going to be a pretty unusual number. I think it was 8,532.11, if I could squeak out the 0.11, which is hard to do in NFTs. Maybe somebody listening can figure out why that's an interesting number, but ultimately decided to go with the 5,555. And looking at it from the long term, I was like, okay, whether I agree with it or not, if success is viewed as selling out, I want to make sure this sells out. And I don't want to over allocate tremendously. I think we over allocated by 10%. I mean, we made, like, every decision was made very, very carefully. But what I did realize very quickly, and people warned me about this, is, man, are there a lot of whiny bitches in Web3. It's just like, it's like you, and which in a way is very freeing, because if you realize that no matter what you do, options A to Z, it doesn't matter.
Someone's going to be mad.
Not just someone, but usually some many. And that's kind of freeing. It's like if you're going to get a tomato thrown at you, no matter what you do, you're like, okay, cool, whatever. I don't need to be afraid of getting hit with a tomato because it's going to happen no matter what. And
once you realize nobody really knows, to the point you're making, nobody really knows the right answer. We don't have 10 years of textbooks on how to market via an NFT. No. Like, it's so emergent, which segues us beautifully to having you explain emergent long fiction. I want to get a little bit into the specifics here. I know you've explained it on other podcasts, but worth repeating. Sure. What is emergent long fiction? ELF, ELF, what do you call it? ELF. Did you dub this term? Did you create this term?
Yeah, I did.
You did. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Because people... Yeah, so because people were like, well, is this a PFP project? Because there are several thousand of them. And I was like, no, I'm not thinking about it that way, because a lot of the stuff that is unfolding right now and that still hasn't unfolded, and some of it will unfold in the next few weeks, I had already figured out and planned before the artwork for this was ever done, before the supply was ever decided, right? So like I figured out a lot very early on as with respect to what I wanted to do. The way I make a lot of my career decisions is actually very similar to the way that Scott Adams of Dilbert fame makes a lot of his decisions. And he's written about this very eloquently. So I'd encourage people to look at some of his books as well on career advice. They're actually very, very good. But the basic idea is choose projects based on, because I live my life in sort of 6-month projects and 2-week experiments. That's how I think about things. If you're like, what's your 5-year plan? No fucking idea. No clue. Sorry about the cursing. I'm not sure if that's
that's
okay.
Fine. I curse all the time.
But okay. Yeah. So if I'm thinking about 6-month projects, for me, that's a lot of time. I consider that a lot of time. And 6 months, what am I optimizing for? I'm optimizing for new skills and new relationships. New could also be deepening relationships. That's what I'm looking for. So even if the project fails, right? You have a book and it doesn't hit the bestseller list and you don't get a second book. It's a movie and it flops. It's an NFT and it doesn't sell out. As long as I have this snowball from project to project of relationships and skills that transfer to future projects, you see how you have this compounding effect.
Yeah.
If you do that really deliberately, it is very hard to lose in the long term. It is really hard to lose. So I wanted to bake in something, an approach, first of all, that I would have the stamina to continue doing. This is a mistake. You said you wanted to talk about podcasting a little bit. This is a mistake a lot of people make with podcasting, is they choose a format or a way of approaching their episodes that is completely unsustainable. It might be unsustainable because they're trying to be This American Life, and nobody can be This American Life unless you're set up for it. And trust me, it's a lot harder than you think. Or they choose subject matter that's so narrow that after 50 episodes, they're like, I don't want to do this anymore, or I've run out of things to really talk about. Okay, so emergent long fiction for me solves for all of those things, because fiction allows me to reach out to people I don't usually have a lot of contact with to learn from. In the process, I get to develop relationships with those people. And it opens up the possibility of doing things that I may not have ever considered before, right? It's not an accident that I had Todd McFarlane on my podcast twice, and we talked a lot about how his company works in these different categories like toys and so on, right? That's not accidental. And not to say I'm going to do any of that stuff, but it makes me more interested in those things, and then I learn more as a result. Emergent long fiction is really simple. So emergent long fiction is in some respects nothing new, but I haven't seen it applied to NFTs very well. It may exist. I'm just not aware of it. In the same way that I'm not aware of any podcast that launched at the same time as an NFT project upon which the lore is based, right? I just haven't seen a podcast based on that. So I was excited to see how a first like that would unfold. Emergent long fiction means, in my case, I'm setting a few conditions up front. I've decided on some characters, in this case, some clans or greater houses, the map of this realm, and a few general drivers and motivators in this realm. And so there's this thing called the Greater Games, which is in the free trade zone. It's kind of like the Olympics, but it's one-on-one
FTZ. You know, for those of us who are deep in the pod.
Deep in the pod, yeah, the FTZ. And the Great Games is sort of a gladiatorial games with one-on-one combat, maybe other things, who knows, wink, wink. And the outcome of that determines which house sort of becomes the capital of the realm for a period of time. And there are all these economic benefits and trade benefits that accrue to the clan who the winning fighter represents. And this is what took this entire realm out of the Warring States period. Okay, so I just gave a little snapshot of history. Where that goes from now, I don't know. And that's part of what makes it interesting to me, is I don't know. Because with nonfiction, you're kind of doing carpentry at some point. There aren't as many surprises. Whereas right now, if I wanted to write an episode that talks about how, you know, every third year a fire rages through the lowland forest area of House Hime and causes all of these side effects and and then I don't really explain why that is or what the effects are. If I want to tie up that loose end, I have to figure it out later. And that's fun for me, right? So I get to like open a door that I maybe at some point later, for it to be gratifying to the readers and listeners, I need to close or tie up. I don't always have to. I mean, there's very little I have to do with this project. But to kind of set constraints and then explore how creative you can be within them is really fun for me right now. I'm really enjoying it.
You wrote so much. I know there's like 10,000 words you decided was the minimum you had to write to technically be emergent long fiction. So you have a lot that's already been fleshed out. So where are we right now? You have 9 or 10 podcast episodes that are out that are mostly really introducing the houses and clans and laying the groundwork for the world. I
really appreciate you paying so much attention to this, by the way.
I love it.
Very few hosts are as well prepared in terms of being familiar with the subject matter, because everything is hidden or obvious in the subject matter. So I just want to say I appreciate you being familiar with it.
When you interview Tim Ferriss, you have got to be on your A game. I'm like, this is the most researched man. I listen to a lot of podcasts. There is nobody who's more researched than you. I was like, how can I ever compete? You know? So, I did my homework. I also, as a podcaster, like I'm fascinated by anybody who's doing something that's the intersection of podcasting and NFTs. And I love it. There was so much just comic book stuff in the early days of NFTs. It was like, oh, if you're going to tell a story, if you're going to tell lore, it's going to be a comic book. And I'm loving watching people break out of that and find other ways that aren't either getting a movie deal to tell the story. And so I think that's super cool. But so you have these first 9 or 10 episodes. What's great about them too is they're super bite-sized. It's, 10 minutes, maybe. Some of them are shorter than that. How much more do you have already prepped? And then how much that's going to come from this is interacting with the community and getting feedback from the community, which is often part of the appeal of NFTs.
Yeah, so I would say I have quite a bit. I've quite a bit still done, and I have a lot of things in kind of skeleton form that I may or may not use. And those notes exist in a bunch of different places. I mean, it's important to keep somewhat organized. So I use just the typical suite of tools. If I want to do a larger project, then I might end up using something like a Scrivener for keeping things in order. That's what I use for most of my have used for most of my nonfiction books. But the interactivity piece is TBD. I mean, I have played with it. What's interesting is like, I think it's fair to say that most people don't know what they want. And I think that
is this like the Ford thing that like if I asked them what they wanted, they would have said faster horses?
It's 100% that.
Okay.
Because and I put myself in that category, by the way. Right. Sometimes we need someone to be like, this is the thing you never knew you needed. And you're like, holy shit. Yeah, that is totally a thing I never knew I needed. Like there's a device, it's called the Dash egg boiler. And if you like hard-boiled eggs, like it's a process to hard-boiled eggs. But you've just assumed like there's no better option. And then you see this thing, you're like, oh my God, it's a tablespoon of water. And like 5 minutes later, it turns itself off and you have perfectly hard-boiled eggs. Why have I never seen this thing before? But if I were to ask you what you need in your kitchen, if you're not aware of that, you'd never name it.
No.
But not to push this segment too hard, but I will just say that asking the NFT audience what they want is a risky business because it's a very fickle audience in general. Not everybody. I'm not saying everybody. So if whoever's listening out there and about to get their hackles up, relax, please. But in general, it is a culture of FOMO that gets swayed very quickly by whatever is hot, whatever has had its floor price go up, whatever fill in the blank metric has exploded. And I find it very boring, to be honest. And I do think also just online with so many things competing for attention, it is very hard to get a clear signal asking a large audience, what do you want? And the reason I bring this up is that people say they want to collaborate, or a lot of people do. I'm not sure I buy it actually, because for instance, I was playing around with one of the histories of one of the greater houses. And I was like, okay, well, like maybe let me lob out sort of an open option to like influence a piece of the lore and see what happens. So I asked, at house, because I have Twitter handles for each of these houses, at house, I can't remember who it was. Might have been House Nemos or the clerics, like at House Nemos, what are some of your most cherished beliefs? Something like that. And I did that from the @CockPunch Twitter account. And there were people who played ball. But then there were also people who said, oh, wow, well, if the seventh scribe, who's this narrator, right? If the seventh scribe is already getting writer's block, like, Jesus, what are we going to do? And I'm like, asshole, you guys wanted this to be interactive, or a lot of you did. So, but it just goes to show, for me, what I take away is design around making yourself happy, because at least then you have hopefully a reliable source and you're not going to get conflicting answers. Okay. But to give you a more direct answer, I will continue to play with things like this. But what I have seen, and I'm not saying, by the way, that I've executed everything perfectly and I know this is going to be a huge, massive, mega success for decades. I'm not saying any of that. This is, as I've said from day one, like this is a creative experiment. And if people are going to engage with it, I want them to engage with it from the perspective of entertainment, right? Like treat this like 2 trips to the theater or whatever it might be. Another reason you can't like predict anything based on what's happening in patterning off of projects is there are too many macro elements that are unaccounted for. And I mean, not the least of which is just the price of ETH and so on, right? So it's very hard to actually pull real signal that you can rely on as a predictor of future outcomes in any way in NFTs. It's very hard. It's not impossible in some cases, but it's very hard. So I'm looking forward to more interactive experiments. The AI is an example of that. The AI art competition is an example of that. And there may be more coming related to that, building off of it.
Are you more bullish, less bullish, equally bullish on NFTs and Web3, given where you are in this process right now?
So I'm going to ask you to add a little bit more detail to the question.
Okay.
So bullish on what over what period of time?
The technology on-chain, like tokenized assets, on-chain assets as a critical part of culture and society over, frankly, any period of time.
Yeah, I'm bullish on tokenized assets and digital scarcity and digital ownership. I'm bullish on that. I think that
would you recommend another writer, creator, somebody who wants to create a piece of fiction or maybe even nonfiction, launch an NFT? And what would be the constraints that would make you say they should or they shouldn't?
Yeah, it all comes down to what your goals are. So let me this I think this is actually a super interesting line of exploration. So I want to try to unpack it. Why would they be tempted to engage with NFTs to begin with, rather than, let's just say, publish a book, write an article, be on the masthead for a magazine, create a Substack? Like why are they even interested in NFTs to begin with?
You're asking me.
I'm asking you, like like, let's say you're my friend who's like, should I do this thing in fiction or nonfiction? What is even drawing your attention to NFTs as a possibility?
So I look at somebody like Ben Mesrick, who I've had on the podcast before, who's written amazing books and Bitcoin Billionaires, et cetera, who seems to genuinely love having the back and forth with his community in a Discord about his works, doing some treasure hunts type thing through his path, like creating that. Not now, you don't need 1,000 true fans, which I think that concept I first heard about because of your show probably 8 years ago or something, but 100 true fans because they're even more diehard because they're even more connected to you. So I would, that's one route that I see creatives going. I think the question to me, and maybe it's to you, is like, how big is that market? I was like, I'm exhausted having to talk to people all the time.
I think it's tiny. I think it's really small. Is my knee-jerk response. I think the number of people who legitimately want to assemble a team or manage themselves a Discord full of sort of like degens who are kind of like hungry birds, like, hungry baby birds, like I think is very, very low. Now, that doesn't mean I mean, look, I've interacted with my fans in some capacity or another. Let's not forget 1,000 blog posts and comments, right? Since 2007.
Here's the
I've
question.
interacted. Yeah,
Sorry,
fire away.
I cut you off. I was gonna say, does it become table stakes though, right? Like I think plenty of musical artists or anybody was like, I don't want to have social media, but it's table stakes now to being a famous musician and having people hear my music. And does this become something that over time, if you want to be a creative, if you want to have, you have to have a tokenized community of some sort that you give extra access or perks to?
I don't think so. I think that, but this may be maybe in my contrariness, if that's the right word, I am being formulaic and I've got my own ideology I'm not aware of. But I would say whenever I hear, because I've been through many cycles of tech, and at one point I was told, Vine is table stakes. I'm like, okay. And I was like, I don't think I'll be good at Vine. I don't think I'm going to enjoy Vine. And I'm not going to have endurance for those two reasons. And therefore, I'm just going to assume that there's always a market for quality in almost any medium, and just get fucking great at least one of those things. What I tend to see is people who are like, I've heard that I have to do X, but it's not just X, it's A through X. And they're just not, they're mediocre at best at a lot of things. And by the way, AI is going to eat a lot of that for lunch. So,
but here's the thing: Vine wasn't actually table stakes, but social media certainly was. And you know, like
here's a crazy idea. I will say that I don't even think social media is table stakes right now. I know people who have newsletters that go out to investors, and they make, I don't know, $20-30 million a year, and all they use is email, and they barely use email at that. So I think it depends on what you are after.
Yes.
But do you need to be on social media to make money? No. There are many examples from my podcast guests who abhor social media, and they do better. They do very, very, very well financially, right? If you want to be famous, first of all, be careful what you ask for.
You've got a great blog post on that.
Yeah, 11 reasons not to become famous. I encourage everybody to read it, because there's such a sickness of popularity fetishizing online. I mean, just look at the sort of mental health trends in the United States, and these are just the things that we can measure. But in terms of diagnoses, hospital admittances, and so on, prevalence of suicide, I mean, everything's skyrocketing. And it's not singularly caused by, say, social media, but I do think these are contributing factors. So I think you can get away with breaking most rules, is I guess what I'm trying to say.
Let's say this. So if you're saying social media isn't table stakes either, which, okay, I buy that. And I think it's actually even, as the pendulum swings, it's swinging that way because followers are meaning less and less as more and more people have more and more followers. I think most people in Web3, if you said tokenized communities were to become something akin to social media in their prevalency and relevance, even if not everybody had to use them, they'd be like, we are going to make it.
Well, I know everybody wants to say we're going to make it, but here's what I'll say. I get it. But well, let me say one thing, I'll say a lot of things, but I'll say anybody listening, if you interact with anyone who has only high conviction statements, like, they have to be willing to say, like, I don't have any fucking idea, which I say a lot. If someone only has high conviction statements, and especially if they only have high conviction statements in one direction, right? Like all bullish NFTs or Web3, that is proof they are not exhibiting any critical thinking. Like, so you have to be willing to push back a little bit and test assumptions. So what I would say is Web3, if we define it as having a sort of ownership layer or ownership aspect to it, I don't think that's going anywhere. Right. So it's like, is Web3 going to get it if defined as such? Yes, Web3. And I think companies are going to use it, and individuals for all sorts of things, institutions possibly, including things we probably don't like. I don't think that's going away. NFTs, I don't know. I got to say, like, the NFT space is one of the, not everybody, you know what I'm going to say, is one of the meanest, most aggressive communities I don't even know if you can call it a community, because it's largely
we're all just
people
down real bad, Tim. We've all just lost a lot of money. It's made us real angry. No,
but that's not. But that's not. You know, it was bad. It was bad even in the bull market. It's worse now, but it was bad already. Yeah. And also, I shouldn't say I don't give a shit if you lost some money, but like I'm down like 70% net worth, right? Or what, something like that. I don't know. It's a lot. And I'm just like, but does that entitle me to treat everyone like an asshole? No. And like, of course, if you're starting with less and you're down that much, I'd say, number one, Jesus, like, don't bet in speculative assets, that which you can't afford to lose. But like, I feel for people, and it's not a legitimate excuse for the behavior that I see. It's so bad. It is so bad that I know a lot of creators who are very legitimate, very accomplished, like good people in other fields who have like dipped their toe in Web3, and they're like, these people are terrible. Like, I'm out of here. I don't want to do this. Like, there's no reason for me to have to contend with this. So I do think that there's some housekeeping. If people want widespread adoption, and you kind of have to decide if you do or you don't, right? If there's gonna be this like sort of, if you're gonna become like an angry gatekeeper who like throws buckets of crap at every new entrant, you can't simultaneously say, I am sort of the shepherd of this technology into widespread adoption, and I'm here to be a helper instead of hurting things. So
there are definitely a lot of people here, maybe even especially early folks, for whom they found a community who were misfits. I think anybody who's here now is a misfit in some way. I would certainly put myself in that category, but for in different ways, you feel like you think you're a misfit or are a misfit, who don't actually want it to go mainstream, and maybe would straight up say that, or maybe wouldn't say that, but don't want to lose the club that they started with. And
100%.
so I guess I'm curious.
And let me say this, I'm okay with that.
Yeah.
In a way.
But then know that you're doing that, and don't be an asshole.
Yeah, just know you're doing that. And if like you're in it to be an asshole, then don't be surprised when
people don't want to come play.
A lot of people don't want to play, and then if you don't have widespread support, then your assets go down in value.
Right. Yeah. So let's go through a couple categories, because I think this is really interesting. Like, you look at what Starbucks is doing with loyalty programs, on-chain loyalty, NFTs. Is that you're like, yes, widespread brands will do this, or I don't know, some will play, who knows what happens?
Way above my pay grade. I think a lot of brands will say, you know what? We missed the boat on A, B, and C, and I'm going to get fired if we miss the boat on D, because it's on my watch. So I'm the senior vice president of fill in the blank. Like, I don't think I'm going to get fired for saying, let's carve out a small part of our budget for this quarter and put it into Web3 just in case. I think you're going to see a lot of companies playing with it. But I will say that I feel like the public perception in my audience, which is mostly non-NFT, from let's just say mid 2021 to now, has soured tremendously on NFTs. It is a dirty word. It is synonymous with scam. And
have you been dealing with that? Like, is your audience coming after you at all for having?
I mean, my audience isn't. Well, let's see. My audience isn't coming after me, or maybe I just don't care. I would say that I try to cull my audience every once in a while. Actually, I like to cull the herd to thin.
Oh, cull. I thought you said call. I was like,
no, CULL. I try to thin the herd every once in a while, and this is actually a pretty good example of it. But what I would say is, on Twitter, where this is, one might believe that just like everybody's talking about NFTs. You have, in some cases, a receptive audience. On, say, Instagram and other platforms, the vast majority of my audience was like, oh my God, Tim, please, I can't believe like you've done so much in this and this and this. Please don't do NFTs. Please, please, please. Or like, I'm so disappointed. Like, that was the majority of the feedback. And I've tried very hard to do a lot for a lot of people. And despite that, there was tremendous amount of pushback. Now, if somebody says, please, please don't do it, that's fine. If someone says like, oh my God, I can't believe this, I'm unfollowing you, I'm like, great. If that's all it takes, without you knowing anything about the project, and with 100% of the primary sale proceeds going to a nonprofit foundation, like, if that's your reaction, I don't actually want to interact with you. So Godspeed. I hope you find what you're looking for. I do that quite a lot. Like, if I start taking myself too seriously, then I'll do something that requires patience on the part of my audience. And if they don't have any patience, I'm like, okay, great. I hope you enjoy, the next 100 TikTok videos you watch today.
I want to maybe put steer this a little more positive before I lose my entire audience.
Oh yeah. Sorry guys. Yeah. And also I know that, I don't know what I had to drink this morning. Maybe I need more coffee, but we can go longer so that you can,
cool. Yeah, I realize. I'm actually really enjoying this. And I think it's so, I'm totally with you, which is like, you can't just drink hopium all the time. And I'm like a fan of that. I'm like, let's be real. Yeah. And I can be in my bubble. I love talking to people like you who have such broad exposure, who are inclined to be open to something like this. So you're not somebody who's going to write it off immediately, and you run in circles of people who are inclined to be open about something like this, but you're not entirely of it such that you've lost perspective on like what people think. I think you're the perfect perspective to get. But I do think there's some interesting things that I've heard you talk about and that I know your community has done with COCKPUNCH that I want to see if there's some good to sell this year, which is one thing you've talked about was like this competition using AI in a unofficial Discord, because you don't have a Discord, which I don't either. And I almost want to talk about the Discord decision, but this unofficial Discord that was set up where people ran cockfights basically with their cockpunch characters using AI and would run the battles. Maybe speak to that a little bit. And I'm curious if you drew any conclusions from that were like, oh, this is really interesting. This is a way that NFTs are different or not, or whatever, what you kind of drew from what your audience did and talk about it.
Yes, I will answer all those things. And first, let me just say, lest I've been sounding like the sourest boomer ever, it's just like, no, these kids, oh God, you know. Although I think most of the assholes are not kids, actually. But that's a side note.
That's interesting.
I think they're disillusioned, middle-aged men for the most part. And like, I feel for them, but let's put that aside. What I want to say, so that like, why the hell am I doing this podcast, right? If I hate this stuff so much, like, what am I doing here? And I will say that COCKPUNCH as a creative unlock has exceeded all of my expectations. All of my expectations. So if the price and the tax I pay for that is dealing with a bunch of fudders and idiots on the internet for a handful of weeks, even if I was like, you know what, I'm done with Web3, I don't want to touch it again, I would still be very, 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 very happy that I've done everything that I did up to this point, because the relationships I've built, the people I'm in touch with, the conversations I'm having are so interesting and new to me that I really feel like this is a new chapter in my life of creative exploration, which is really exciting. So I'm very happy that I did it. What was the question again?
It was about specifically, I know your audience, and I kind of already gave the overview of it, which is literally what I just said.
The unofficial Discord and
correct.
This stuff. So that is exactly the type of thing I was hoping might emerge with Emergent long fiction, because fiction does not automatically mean a fictional novel. Fiction is storytelling. Most of what we consider true, as far as the stories we tell ourselves, are also fiction, at least partially fictionalized. And I didn't have a Discord for a lot of reasons. A number of my friends I trust were like, Discord's where all the evil comes out. Don't do it. And I was like, okay, I don't need that. I absolutely don't need that. And if people want to congregate, they'll figure out a way to self-assemble, or someone will take a leadership role. And that's exactly what happened. Like within 48 hours of Mint, I wasn't surprised. I was a bit worried, honestly, because I wasn't sure if it was someone kind of hijacking something of the moment, or if it was someone with better intentions. Turned out to be the latter, which I'm thrilled about. And the unofficial Discord ended up doing, and I think it was Drew Barman. Am I getting his name right? Let me make sure I'm getting his name right.
That actually, didn't you do a thing with him recently?
Yeah, I did.
Yeah, it is Drew Barman then.
Yeah, so Drew, I met him at the Art Blocks meetup in Marfa, Texas. Most recently, that was the second annual. I did go to the first annual as well. And he suggested that I check out these AI cockfights. And initially I was like, what does that even mean? Like, I don't even know what does that even mean? And I hopped into this Discord, first time ever in Discord, for a lot of reasons. I mean, there are a lot of security. There have been historically a lot of security risks and all sorts of potential types of grift in Discord. So I've just stayed away from it in general. But hopped into this unofficial Discord and saw these fights. And the way it works, just so I can explain, and I'm not doing it full justice, but the basic idea is people have these NFTs and they enter themselves into brackets, just like you would have like an NCAA tournament. And then they have their attributes as well. So they have a name for their character, and then they have some of the attributes as you would see the attributes on OpenSea. Then the moderator / he's more of a referee / commentator, in this case, Happy Cow, who does a great job, will then he will use a prompt in ChatGPT, which is something like, describe an epic battle between so-and-so and so-and-so with these following attributes, and ending in a single winner, because it's sort of a melee round. Oftentimes there'll be like 4 fighters at once. And then he will read the ChatGPT output very dramatically, just like a real-time sportscaster, doing a blow by blow at a boxing match. and then there was somebody who hopped in because we were on the voice channel in Discord while looking at the chat channel, if that makes sense. There are all these people posting memes and all this hilarious commentary. And then simultaneously the voice stuff is going on and somebody hopped in with a Japanese instrument or some synthesizer, or I don't even know how they did it, but a shamisen. I'm a big fan. I used to live in Japan. I'm a big fan of this instrument. So suddenly somebody's playing a shamisen in the background while all this fighting is going on. And it was so fun. It was so much fun. I mean, I was dying laughing. I was sweating through my clothing. I was laughing so hard. And I was like, okay, this is exactly why I did this, right? It's not just because I want to see what I can unlock creatively. It's because I want to see what other people unlock creatively. And that is a non-obvious, perfect output of something I could not have predicted. It's not, if I had asked people to do it, it would not be the same. It wouldn't have turned out nearly as good. That is part of the Emergent long fiction experiment. It's
also the ownership piece, I would guess, right? It's
for
people
sure.
owning these
Shared
that
incentive.
Make them want to do that in a way that it just reading a book about COCKPUNCH or just listening to the podcast and being like, oh, there's these different characters. They would feel it wouldn't be as interesting to them to watch the Cox fight.
Yeah, totally.
And so that feels crazy. Is that something you would use? Is that like the main thing you would use if somebody was like, somebody outside this world was like, Tim, what's been fun about NFTs? Like, would you point to that and the incentive piece that you're describing, the ownership piece, as like, that's the thing?
Well, we're talking about sort of cause and effect or contributing factors and outputs, right? So the financial alignment, here's what I would say. I think the financial incentive is like a lot of psychedelics is going to be. This will make sense in a second. Meaning, it's a non-specific amplifier. So it doesn't automatically amplify the bad. It doesn't automatically amplify the good, but it will amplify whatever is there. So what remains to be seen, because you could take Harry Potter, 50 Shades of Grey, Twilight, right? 50 Shades of Grey started out as Twilight fan fiction.
Fan fiction. Yep.
Right. No financial incentive though.
Yeah.
That's more like crowd reception, positive feedback incentive, probably, right? Because there are these massive fan fiction sites. And so the fact of the matter is that fans coalesce sometimes in very powerful ways without a shared financial incentive. The financial incentive allows you to force it a bit. You can skip a lot of the groundwork and you can force people to be in a shared cohort just because they all want, when number go up. They want their number to go up. It remains to be seen if that is for this particular experiment a good or a bad thing. I do think there's a chance that this shared financial incentive is actually mostly corrosive and not mostly positive. I think there's a good chance that that's the case. If that is the underlying fundamental binding mechanism, I think it probably will end up emphasizing some of the lesser aspects of human nature is my guess.
The question to me is, I'm fully in alignment that just like the full financial speculation that we've seen in this era we've been in has had a lot of negative ramifications, clearly, and a lot of negative. Does it evolve past that point where these things become fun ways to be a part of a community where maybe you can subsidize experiences without expecting crazy financial reward? And does it still serve an awesome purpose then when we leave this era of everybody just expecting the number to go up? Like, can it still create that incentivization? Can it still create something magical that means you don't have to literally be Harry Potter or Star Wars to have like a diehard community that wants to create fan fiction? You don't have to be the number one book in the world. Can NFTs spur
totally.
that even if some of the financialization pieces become less central?
I hope so. I mean, I do think, 1,000 True Fans, I'll give credit where credit is due. Kevin Kelly, anybody can read it, kk.org. I think it is, if you're going to read one of maybe 3 or 4 articles on marketing and entrepreneurship in general, that would be on the list. I I hope that's the case. I hope that's the case. I do think that a few things would probably need to change, and I'm not sure how they would change. The first is that the time frame over which people focus on these aligned financial incentives is very short.
Yeah.
Certainly on NFT Twitter. It is the most scattered, impulsive, impatient. That's on the negative side. Some people are just really, really, really good short-term flippers, and they're using technology to aid that. And like, hey, okay, if you want to be like somebody out of Flash Boys, that Michael Lewis book, like,
yeah,
hey, good for you. If you can win at that game and that's your game, good for you. But that would need to change. So there would need to be some way to change that either culturally or through mechanics. And I know people do various things to try to encourage people to hold on to your stuff. But then I feel like I'm on a date with someone and I'm paying them to stay on the date. And I'm like, I don't really I don't want them here if they don't want to be here. You know, like if you if you don't want to be here, like I don't want to bribe you to be on this date with me. That feels so gross. So, so I do see some of the mechanics that way. Like these people would not be here other than through effectively long-term bribes that keep them from being short-term flippers. I don't want to do that. Like I have no plans to do that myself, but will it help to coalesce communities in a way that was impossible beforehand? Yeah, probably. I just think if you look at intrinsic versus extrinsic reward and say I can't cite the studies right now, but I'm sure somebody could in behavioral economics and also just in psychological studies, where you take something that someone enjoys and you have a group of people who are doing this thing they enjoy, and then you offer to pay them based on ranking and so on. And then all of a sudden everything changes. And these people don't really like doing what they were doing before.
Right. It takes away the joy. It goes from being a hobby to a profession in a way that psychologically changes everything about the thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
I won't belabor this for too much longer. I think what excites me is some of the Starbucks stuff. It is this evolution in marketing that may be good, may be bad, but we went from like, hey, I sell you a product, you buy the product. Then things got more competitive. So it was like basically shop to earn is what loyalty programs are today. You buy a product from me and I give you a free, coffee down the line. To it's even more competitive now. It's because we're giving you rewards for even more like ambiguous behaviors, like engage with our brand and we'll reward you. And that's sort of where the market is moving. And NFTs is a really interesting tool and a more efficient tool once some of the tech is a little bit smoother and more people are onboarded, et cetera, in which to do a lot of that. So I think that's a big thing that I'm excited about.
Yeah, I agree. I'm excited to see the experiments. I just would say whenever you're inclined, and I'm saying you, the people listening, not you, Carly, but whenever I am inclined to think I have to do ABC, I heard a lot of this with book publishing. Like, well, after a year and a half, you go to paperback. And I was like, well, why would I go to paperback? And they're like, well, that's what you do. So people who are price sensitive can buy the book. I'm like, there's Kindle now. If somebody doesn't want to paperback,
are your books not on paperback at all?
Not a single one of my books is in paperback. And let me tell you why. Because if I'm at, let's just say 12% or 12 to 15%, let's say 15 to make it easy, 15% royalty hardcover, and you can buy the book for $12. Let's just say after discounting on Amazon and so on. If I go to paperback, my royalty goes from that to 6.5, let's just say. And I'm using the numbers I'm using aren't great examples, but my royalties get cut in half. What does that mean? I need to sell twice as many books to make the same amount in royalties, and it is not preventing anyone from reading this book, in the sense that if you don't want to pay the hardcover price, you can get a Kindle, or you can pirate stuff if you really want to go through the labor of doing that. And so ultimately, I don't feel like I am in any way shortchanging my would-be readers, but still to this day, the vast majority of authors will go to paperback. There's no compelling reason for that, in my opinion. So no book of mine has ever gone to paperback.
I'm actually surprised I didn't know that. I'm assuming you've talked about that publicly before.
In the US.
and they couldn't like 14. Wow. And your books are not like, I mean, I think I read,
big.
I did 4 Hour Work Week was digitally I did. So I did, but 4 Hour Body, I mean, that is a paperweight that itself could be your kettlebell. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah.
Use that for your,
it's huge.
your squats or whatever it is.
Yeah. It's huge.
Okay. I want to be sensitive of your time. I want to do a little bit on just podcast tech stuff, but before we leave this stuff here, I'm curious. I like this lens you're describing where it sounds like you like being in this space. You're not really sure where it's going to go. You think there's been some really fun creative stuff that have happened with your NFT projects and with NFTs in general, but you're liking being here because you're developing so many skills by being here. And I think I feel similarly of like, I'm engaging with things that'll be valuable wherever this all goes. You're talking about rigging, you're talking about Unity, Unreal. Is there anything you would point out amidst everything that you're learning and playing with to make this NFT project possible that you're like, this is like my favorite, or you go learn this, audience, because holy shit, you know? And it sounds like you're going to be teaching us some of this stuff too as you learn it.
Yeah, I would, well, there's what I'm excited about, and then there's go learn this. I would say right now, my recommendation would be people should look at the incredible work that Artifact has done with Artifact creators and galvanizing a community to really engage with 3D models. And Blender would be a tool specifically. They have some great tutorials they've put out. I actually put out a tweet recently listing 2 or 3 of them, asking for feedback, how people had experienced those tutorials. They've done a really nice job. So they've done a really, I think, exceptional job of galvanizing their audience with respect to 3D models. And I haven't yet decided what I want to do with these files that I have, because I want to give people something they can use. So for instance, I have an employee who's testing 3D printing right now, because you might think you just take any 3D file and ship it to Shapeways and you can print it out. It's not that straightforward. So I want to ensure that there is some use for the 3D models that people will find fun before I make them available. And if I need to modify them and for certain purposes that's desirable before releasing them, then I'll just wait and I'll do it in a little bit. As far as what I'm most excited about, honestly, it's engaging with people who are really outside of the nonfiction world, right? If you want to engage with comic book artists and writers and inkers and colorists and all this stuff, you don't really do that in nonfiction in the United States. In Japan, it's different, but in the United States, you don't. If you want to look at toys, like I'm not going to make a Tim Ferriss toy, right? I don't want to sell T-shirts with my face on them, but like potentially like COCKPUNCH merch. I mean, it's sort of a no-brainer. I mean, there's some. I've been doing a lot of doodling on iPad and Remarkable and different tablets, and working with artists on various things. None of which are guaranteed to come out. I just want to make that clear, right? Because in my FAQ for the Mint, it was very clear, like no roadmap, no Discord, no promises beyond like, here's a funny image and there will be some fiction and a podcast, and that's it. And I've already, as of once I have 2 more episodes, I will have delivered on my promise of the number of podcast episodes. I hope to do more. So those are a few things that I'm excited about. And if I were to make an ask of my audience or anyone, you don't have to own one of these NFTs to do this. That's the fun also, is like you learn Blender, because I will make some of my files available, and I want to see what you can do.
Let me
I think
ask,
it'll be fun.
Is there, I guess, and this is totally a selfish question because I'm starting to dive into this stuff and I'm interested in like the spatial web and, are there low cost ways to start getting engaged with these softwares, as somebody who hasn't fully looked into it yet, or like to start playing around? Or is it like, it's Adobe whatever and you have to buy the $200 whatever, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah. As far as I know, you can download Blender for free and start toying around with it right away. So that is my understanding. Yeah, if you just go to blender.org, boom, you can download it, which was part of the decision. Yeah, Blender is free open source 3D creation software. It's a suite.
And for folks who are holders or might be holder, like, might buy one after this podcast, what's the best way? You don't have a Discord. Is it to follow their respective house on Twitter? What's the best way to, if they want to be a part of this community, engage with things, where should they go?
Yeah, I would say the easiest things to do are follow at COCKPUNCH on Twitter. Subscribe to my newsletter because I do tend to share things with the newsletter first.
Tim.blog?
Tim.blog/Friday. 5 Bullet Friday has, I don't know, around 2 million subscribers now. It's free. People like it. It's a very short, 5-minute read every Friday of bullet points of the coolest things that I've come across that week. And I do come across a lot of cool stuff because my network from the podcast and everything is very, very eclectic and good. And so I'd say Twitter at COCKPUNCH, and then at T Ferriss if you want to follow me, TFERRISS. Sometimes I'll kind of stay in character on the at COCKPUNCH account. So if you want to see other things that I'm exploring, then at TFERRISS. And then cockpunch.com has links to a lot. There will be more coming. And then I would say check out the unofficial Discord. I think it's, let's see.
We'll link to all this so we make sure that people have the right links. Do you, have you considered like putting the COCKPUNCH podcast on a platform that sort of more enables discussion and forum chats directly as people are listening to the podcast? Like that's the limitation to me in podcasting in general. It's like I listen to it on Apple Podcasts and then it's like, I can't comment right there or sort of engage with it right there. Have you thought about that at all?
Yeah, I've thought about it. I mean, the question for me, whenever you create the possibility for interaction or user-generated content is, what are the expectations of the people using it? And how are you going to engage with it? Like, what is the clear why? Why are you doing it? And I don't think the majority of folks who optimize for engagement have a great answer for that, other than the sort of religious dictum that commandment 1, more engagement is better, period. But it's not terribly well thought through. There are examples where engagement really is rewarding in the case of, say, the AI cockfights in the unofficial Discord. The interaction is what makes it fun, right? That is what makes it fun. For me, though, what I'm trying to do, and this is probably way too old fashioned, but like the most advanced computer and simulation master machine that we have to use is right here between the ears. And so for instance,
so
I have
old
not,
fashioned.
I haven't published the text yet of these background histories.
I know.
I'm forcing people to listen to them. And because I want to reward people who pay attention, because there are Easter eggs and there's a lot coming where hopefully people will really engage and sniff around. And I've said this before, but people have not paid enough attention to some of the underreported or unreported sort of hidden traits on these characters and the naming of the attributes and so on. So it's intended to be a world.
What was the thing? You spent a lot of hours on naming.
Yeah, at least 10 hours on naming 300 plus attributes. Yeah, at least. And it's fun for me, number one, because I like naming. I think there's a power in naming. And I think a lot about the power of names going back to the 4-Hour Workweek and even before that. And what I hope to do with this project also is basically to disprove a lot of the must-dos or can't-dos in Web3, right? So for instance, if you read the FAQ, it's pretty aggressive. Like my FAQ is aggressive. And it's like, if you're a dick, I reserve the right to ban you and block you from anything I do in the future to the extent that I can. And, by buying this thing, you're kind of agreeing to these terms and conditions and blah, 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 blah. And if you go to, at least last time I was there, this unofficial Discord, like it is a very positive little tiny compartment. And I think that's pretty, from what I've well, from what I've seen, that's pretty hard to find in Web3 and NFTs without it devolving at some point. And I think there are some folks who are doing a good job of that, but it takes effort and it takes governance on some level. I don't think the best of human nature automatically floats to the top if you just make it like an anarchy free for all. I just don't think that's true.
The best of human nature doesn't necessarily float to the top on the internet, right? Like I think the internet just anything internet based and anonymity based is that's just
the anonymity is a big
territory.
one. The anonymity is a big one. Yeah.
Okay. A couple final questions around like podcasting media. Can we do it? Are you game? You're around?
Yeah, I'm game.
I so appreciate you. Okay. You were just mentioning this. You don't want your face on a t-shirt. You don't want, you've never done that kind of thing.
I'm sure I'm a narcissist, but I'm not that much of a narcissist. Like, it's too much.
I don't know. I could be fun someday, but,
you'll know I've fallen on hard times.
Some high fashion kind of like, luxury get together with G Money. I don't know. I think I could see it.
Who knows?
In any case, I think what's striking about that, jokes aside, is we are in this era of media companies, social media, and consumer goods companies just becoming a circle. That Venn diagram is just becoming a circle. And you have Kim Kardashian and her private equity fund, or Mr. Beast and his chocolate bars, which will inherently push, necessitates that Hershey start their channel to compete with Mr. Beast now because he's in their business, whatever, right? Mm-hmm. You seem to have no compulsion. You've never really gone that route. You had Brain Quicken obviously as your first company, but you never released the Tim Ferriss, 10 trillion things going off at once here. You've never released the Tim Ferriss supplements. Lunchbox, anti-hand perspirants. I was laughing listening to you and Kevin Rose talking about how to make your hands not sweat when you rock climb.
Rhino. Yep.
Yeah. Like, why?
Because time and attention are finite resources, and all of those things consume energy and attention. Number one. Number two, I lose respect for people when they shill any possible line extension that they can. I think it reflects for me a lack of focus. Sometimes it reflects a lack of integrity. Not always. There are people who productize and I think do a great job and take it very seriously. So I have no issue, for instance, with like Ryan Reynolds having Aviator Gin. It's like, okay, it's like focus.
He's
but
also
he's not
so dang good at it.
Yeah, he's so good. He's good. I mean, he's excellent on so many levels. But if someone focuses on one or a handful of things, I find that my curiosity is piqued. If someone's doing 20 different things, my assumption is, and I've yet to come across a single exception. Maybe they exist. If someone's doing 20 things, they're probably doing a mediocre job of all of those things. Is my personal experience in life so far. Lastly, for me as a writer, if I am taking the craft of nonfiction seriously, doing extremely in-depth, meticulous, long-term research. There's a car alarm going off that's distracting me. So if I am being entrusted to provide a read on research and my summarization of interacting with experts and so on, if I'm talking about nutrition and I also have my own nutrition or supplement line, I mean, I could have made tens of millions of dollars without any question if I had piggybacked the 4-Hour Body on my own line of supplements.
Of course.
And I chose not to do that, which believe me, at the time that I mean, even now, I mean, it's a life-changing amount of money. And I decided not to do it because it would, number one, make people question my motives. And it would be much harder for me to be viewed as someone striving to be an objective reporter or experimenter. And secondly, humans are humans. I mean, look at, we're talking about financial incentives, right? Maybe it would bias me in some way. Mm-hmm. Maybe I wouldn't always push my own thing, but maybe if there was a direct competitor, I'd be like, maybe there's a third option where I can avoid endorsing a direct competitor because that doesn't really do any harm. And I can suggest a kind of generic option B, and et cetera, et cetera. We are all vulnerable to strong incentives. So I have avoided that by and large. Now, with something like COCKPUNCH, right? I'm not curing cancer. I'm not, although, I mean, all the funds are going to Saisei Foundation, which will do a lot of serious work. But as far as the COCKPUNCH brand goes, right? I'm not claiming to be giving the latest and greatest data-backed research related to X. So if I want to do, COCKPUNCH popsicles, like, who knows? Maybe if I think it's going to be funny and I've had some, edibles and I'm just like, that's a hilarious idea. Wouldn't it be funny to come out with COCKPUNCH popsicles? Like, could I get some high school to carry those? Like, what would the conversation be like trying to convince, like, I want a distributor to have that conversation and to, get permission to record it, because that would be really hilarious. Yeah, maybe, right? Because the harm that can do is so little. Mm-hmm. But if I'm reporting on health, if I'm reporting on entrepreneurship and business, and anything that I present as being data backed, I try not to have a dog in the fight. And for instance, I mean, I've been one of the most proactive funders of science related to psychedelic compounds and psychedelic therapeutics. Oh, I was just going to say, from the beginning, I made the decision I'm not going to invest in any for-profit psychedelic companies. And I have easily, I mean, the cost of that is in the many millions of dollars, right? As is the cost by turning down like 80% of the people who come to the podcast for sponsors, to be sponsors, I should say. It's very easy to damage your reputation, and I'm not planning on going anywhere. I'm playing the long game. So for me, it's like, what do we want the money for? Right? Not to get too like metaphysical about it, but it's like, what do we want the money for, really? Like with the lunch boxes and the this and that and the mobile plan and like, oh my God, I'm going to productize myself to the nth degree. It's for either experiences. Maybe it's for prestige. I mean, I think prestige and guilt, or pride and guilt, are two terrible reasons to do most things. Like, a lot of bad decisions can be traced to one or the other, but you can get what you're looking for by circumventing the money in a lot of ways, right? Like, what do I need right now that I would get from all this productizing, if money is the main driver, right? It's like, it doesn't solve your problems. It doesn't. And by creating like 24 or a dozen or even 6 or even 3 new businesses, like, you are giving up some finite resources in terms of attention and energy. So that's a long answer, but I've thought very carefully about this stuff. Yeah,
clearly. Yeah. And that's why it was so striking to me when I really thought about it as well. I was like, knowing how much money there probably was on the table. I think you also, you're an expert, but that expertise is in categories that you could do these experiments yourself. Like, I felt very aware of not having an NFT project as an NFT podcaster, but I didn't want to have an NFT project that was like an alpha group and a Discord and like, I'm going to give you the best alpha, because that wasn't something I felt like I could provide. So the gin became a really fun way to experiment in brand building and learn about the alc industry that could inform content in a way that feels really authentic. And I think that's But I think that's so interesting. We also should mention, and this is what I would say, is that, because we didn't mention it earlier, I feel like people know this already, but you never know what people don't know, which is that 100% of the primary sales for COCKPUNCH went to your foundation, Saisei Foundation, which does research on psychedelics, which, anorexia, depression, obsessive compulsive, like this disorders
opioid use disorder, basically any psychiatric conditions that are considered extremely difficult or near impossible to treat. So novel therapeutics and clinical research, predominantly, not exclusively, focused on those conditions. Since I've been very personally affected by many of these things, my family's been very personally affected. Many of my best friends have been very personally affected. So all the primary sales, which ended up being around, I don't know, between 1.7, 1.8 million. Which was great. And that's already, that'll all be deployed in the next probably 6 to 12 months. Half of it, more than half of that's already been deployed to grants, to grant recipients. So I feel very good about that. If people want to see, sort of peek around some corners and see where I think the future is going with some of the things that Saisei Foundation has supported, you can go to Saisei Foundation, SAISEI Foundation.org, and go to projects. I'm very, very proud of the projects. I mean, it's a lot of firsts. I mean, I would say at least a dozen firsts, and in collaboration with some really good scientists, with people like Michael Pollan for the first journalism fellowship related to psychedelics as a beat, which is critically important as a coverage and self-regulating mechanism in some ways, just to curtail bad behavior and highlight good behavior in the ecosystem. So, thanks for bringing it up. I'm very proud of it. And I did want to, this is many years ago, do a contemporary art auction where all the proceeds would go to, at that time, direct grant recipients, because it was before the Saisei Foundation was founded, which was a while ago. I began funding personally in, I guess, 2015. But the hope with a lot of these firsts, in any case, right, whether it's the foundation, the NFT, is that other people, the AI competition, is that other people will then be able to build off of it.
Yeah, it's worth pointing that out as another thing that I've heard you speak about as sort of an interesting thing with NFTs. Who knows how long it will last? But I am very bullish on digital art as a category. And it seems like as a category that can make it easier, potentially, based on some of the roadblocks you described, trying to sell traditional art as a way to fundraise for your organization. Like, digital art could be an interesting mechanism for these kinds of things. Okay.
Totally.
We'll do some, these are not really rapid fire questions, but like some final questions. So one of the things that I've always loved about you is you're not like a hyper morning person. You so rarely will find somebody who's very successful who is not like, I get up at 5 a.m. and then I go to the gym and I box for 6 hours, whatever, right? And you were always somebody I like from a youngish age where I was like, Tim Ferriss does not get up that early, like what's up? Or like, isn't a morning person. What is your morning routine these days, your routine these days? Tim, as an NFT project founder, what is your life?
Oh, man. Well, let's see. I mean, right now I'm optimizing for a physical strength conditioning training for a bunch of reasons. And if you take care of your body will take care of your mind. I mean, just if you have to view exercise as just the most effective sort of antidepressant known to humankind, then so be it. It's not a punishment for being flawed or anything. I just view it as perhaps something with fewer side effects than taking tons and tons of prescription medications without cycling off. So right now I get up around 7 and I meditate, go downstairs, have a huge cup of coffee, probably have a banana, some type of food, but not too much. I go out and right now I'm in the mountains, so I will do some type of skiing or skiing training. Could be exercises, could be, today I was working on moguls for a host of reasons, for 3 to 4 hours, come back, light lunch, and then the afternoon is for creative work. So for instance, today, I mean, we have this conversation. Normally what I would be doing instead of this conversation is I would be sitting down and focusing on writing. So the 8 greater houses have been published. So for the backgrounds on the 8 greater houses, these clans, somebody could think kind of Game of Thrones like. That's been published, and now stuff gets more interesting as far as I'm concerned, right? Because now we talk more about the interactions. Now we talk about more of the culture and the habits and maybe religion, et cetera, that is found in this realm called Verlata. So I will be working on that today. And then I have one more call towards the end of the day. And I have a physical therapy session for a lower back injury from the aforementioned ski training. And then I will probably be, I don't want to give away too much, but I will be sitting down to do more creative work related to the NFT project that is not fiction writing.
Oh, okay. What time do you go to bed these days?
Right now it's unusual. So normally I would say I go to bed a bit later. But these days I'm going to bed probably 11, I would say 11 p.m.
Okay. Well, you're not really the hero that you once were for me, Tim.
well, let me tell you a few things. So the first is for the first 3 books. So for the things that put me on the map, I was going to bed between 2 and 4 a.m. and waking up kind of whenever I woke up. right? I would still try to get 8 to 9 hours. So I think for my sharpest creative work, I'm up in the middle of the night.
Yeah.
And for some people, that's getting up before everybody else so that you're not dealing with the inbound or you're not tempted to procrastinate as much. For me, it historically has been staying up a lot later. But I mean, I'm not in a relationship right now, but once you're in a relationship, like a romantic relationship, if you have somebody who's on the opposite schedule, it doesn't always work out terribly well. And separately, if you want to have I have found that going to bed really late and waking up really late, especially in the winter, is not great for me as someone with depressive tendencies. It's just not optimal. It's better for me to get more sunlight if I can organize my life around getting more sunlight or some type of light exposure. It could be a blue light. So I think as I've gotten older and have started to realize that it's the relationships, stupid, like that kind of make or break you and your life. That has led my wake cycle and sleep cycle to conform more to, I guess, what we would consider normal. But yeah, at my heart, at my core, I am a night person. And the biggest works that I put out early that kind of got me to, I don't want to say escape velocity, but to a point where I felt like I now have creative freedom, those were all done late at night.
I appreciate that. As as I'm getting older and I have a partner, and it's like, and I also don't feel my best if I sleep in late, but my brain is at its peak at night. It's just like, okay, at least I'm not alone. No. I have to say, it's hilarious hearing you say the word optimal. I hear your Tim Ferriss show intro, optimal, minimal. Like, it's like funny to hear you say the word optimal, not in that context.
Not in that context.
Okay, because I teased it at the beginning of this, I have to ask, and you can refrain from answering. Thoughts on what's happening at Twitter right now? You were an early investor, so it's like, sort of relevant.
I was an early investor, long time ago, pre-IPO. Let's see here. My thoughts on Twitter. I mean, it's kind of like watching professional wrestling. I mean, it's very exciting, and there's been a lot of excitement and entertainment. I mean, the entertainment value, I think, has gone up tremendously. You just mean overall, not from a product perspective, but just kind of
either
overall.
Whatever perspective you would like to share insights or your thoughts on.
Well, I will say that once people could buy verified marks, it made Twitter almost unusable for me because I use that as a sorting mechanism to try to, and it's not a perfect sorting mechanism, but I would use it to try to eke out some signal from the noise. I mean, when you have almost 2 million followers, and there are people who have 100 times that, of course, more. But even with, let's say, 2 million, and that's basically twice the population of San Francisco, roughly, right? Something like that. You can't just read your feed. You need a way to separate signal from noise, and one of those was by sorting at replies by verified, but that is effectively useless now. And so I actually use Twitter less than I used to. I will say also, Elon's a controversial figure, but I think humanity is probably best served with him focusing on SpaceX and Tesla more so than Twitter, I would have to say. I don't think the world would end if Twitter disappeared tomorrow. People would be upset. They'd have to find a new place to complain about it. But Twitter is useful, but it is also one of the nastier neighborhoods on the internet. I mean, it is not where people show their best selves generally. So what are my feelings? I would say personally and professionally, I'm using it less because I find it harder to use and to get signal from noise without doing a lot of front loading. Okay, if you want to go to the trouble of creating small groups / lists and doing that type of kind of manual lift beforehand, sure, I bet you could create these pockets of signal. What I see a lot of people doing is they're just creating private WhatsApp groups instead.
Right.
So I don't know where the product's going, but I think I admire a lot about Elon. and feel like his intellect and capacity is probably best applied to Tesla and SpaceX
and Neuralink, and what's the internet
Neuralink,
one?
all the other stuff.
Starlink. You're like, great, go make internet for the whole world. Love that. Love that for you, Elon.
all that stuff. So I'm using Twitter less and less, in part because, and you're like, not to belabor the point, but I'll do some belaboring on my side, which is, I got this from somebody else, and there are many other people who say this, but like, you're the average of the 5 people you associate with most. Like, you are the average. You will become the average of the people you spend the most time with, and that's true in virtual spaces as well. So it is not cost free to spend a lot of time in small groups or large groups that use complaining as a sport, or slamming other people as a sport. You are going to become those people. And if you think you're immune, you're completely delusional. You are not immune. No one is immune. And that's true physically, financially. Like, you become the average of, like, let's just call it 5 to 10 people you interact with the most. So I have developed a practical repulsion with respect to just a lot of negativity and complaining. You can point out bad things and be like, therefore, I think we should do A, B, and C, and I'm going to do C. Okay, great. That's just problem solving. But if it's just whining and outrage porn and doxing people and destroying people, and like, that's where you're in a group where that is valued, man, you're going to go down with the ship. You're not immune. So I really... I try to dodge those environments as much as possible. There are a lot of awesome people in the world. There are a lot of amazing places where those awesome people congregate, even in small numbers. I'm trying to spend more and more time in those places, or try to set rules and expectations and hopefully conditions such that things like this unofficial Discord pop up, which, could go downhill. But as it stands right now, I'm like, wow, like, this is actually the opposite of everything I've been told exists in these spaces. And that is, that makes me optimistic that it can be done.
There are great people in Web3. There's so much weirdness and negativity. And then there are some just like truly wonderful people, and there's lots of them, but it's sometimes drowned out by the noise. Actual last question. If you were starting your career today, what would you do?
Not to be a pain in the ass, but what am I optimizing for? Like, what do I want?
You're starting your podcast today.
Yep.
I know it's a tricky one. You're starting your podcast today.
Mm-hmm.
How would you approach it? Or how would you approach it maybe differently than you do now as somebody who already has a huge audience and a huge platform?
I'm laughing because even when I started, which was in the Pliocene era, and I want to say 2014. Yep. I was told I was too late. Too many podcasts. That ship has sailed.
Are you serious?
Oh yeah, by many credible people. So I don't think it's too late to start a podcast. I think that would be silly. However, it has become much, much, much more competitive in terms of attention and listenership. If I were starting a podcast today, you're saying in my current personal career point, are you saying like if I were...
Tim, if you were me, what would you do? Just in general in life? Okay. Tell me. Right. Just kidding.
Actually, let me answer that one, if you don't mind.
No, please. Great.
Not to be too presumptive, but because you said something earlier that I bookmarked for myself, and that was when I was talking about how much I appreciated you doing research and being familiar with the content. You said, and maybe you were just joking, but you said, hold on. You said, like, how am I going to compete if I don't do a ton of research? My goal is almost always to be a category of one. Like, don't try to be the best. Try to be the only. And that's borrowing also from Kevin Kelly, also borrowing from the book, The 22 Immutable Laws of Marketing, where there is one short chapter called The Law of Category that I think is really important. And I would just say, do something. If you're trying to stand out, which is not actually mandatory, but if you're trying to stand out, be a category of one. Do something that is easy for you, that is hard for other people, or do something that is fun for you, that is not fun for other people. And ask your friends what those things are, if it's not obvious. Separately, format wise, for me, I do exactly the same thing. I would interview people I would want to talk to anyway.
Yeah.
Because the format gives you permission to ask a barrage of questions in such a way that would be very unnatural in a normal conversation.
Yeah.
So you can really get a lot out of it if you prepare for it and think about it well. And I mean, I would start it very much the way I did. I was like, I'm going to commit to 6 episodes, see if I like it. And at the very least, I'm going to improve my verbal tics or remove some verbal tics. Get better at asking questions, which will translate directly back to what I was doing before, which was interviewing people for nonfiction books. Make sure you can win, even if you lose. Is my advice. Whatever
You were
that
like
might be.
the first. So I started listening to podcasts what I thought was early, which was like 2012. I listened to Planet Money.
That's
I would
early.
listen to NPR
Yeah,
stuff.
early.
And what was so interesting about your show for me was I think of it as the first time that I really listened to somebody doing an interview where you could hear a little bit the process of the interview as you listened. You would give some preamble or, kind of walk the listener along the journey of how you were thinking about conducting the interview, which part of that I listened to highly produced NPR style podcasts or cable broadcast Barbara Walters, where obviously you see none of that.
Yep.
Were you like a forefather of that, or is that just my impression of things? Because you were my first introduction to that.
Good question. I imagine people have done it before, but I modeled or studied a lot of different interviewers. Right? So I looked at
Naturally. Of course you did.
James Lipton from Inside the Actors Studio. I looked at Terry Gross. I looked at Charlie Rose. I had people who had worked as researchers for various shows like those go through my transcript of early episodes and point out where I could have maybe let someone breathe a little bit and answer differently, or where I could have asked questions in a different order. So I was very methodical about trying to improve my ability to interview, but I did not run into someone who did or does what you're describing, which is walking people through the thought process that is leading me to ask questions the way I'm asking them. So I might be one of.
In any case,
folks.
you got so big on podcasting so early. You must have been the introduction to a lot of people to that style, whether you introduced it or not.
Yeah. And I will say also, like, the reason I do that, let me just explain that, is not to teach people how to interview. It's to hopefully help people learn how to craft better questions for themselves, because you can learn and get just about anything you want, but you need a good set of questions, and you need to know how to generate good questions and follow-up questions. And I have found those skills so indispensable, and I was not able to find a school for learning those skills. It was cobbled together over time. And therefore, since the premise of the Tim Ferriss Show is interviewing world-class performers to deconstruct, that's the word I use, right? The habits, routines, favorite books, et cetera, that you can apply in your own lives. You have to ask questions to deconstruct. And that is an absolutely learnable skill. I talk about it a lot, actually, in the meta learning section in the 4-Hour Chef. But by walking people through the approach, which I did recently in this interview with Mark Manson, for instance, I do it a lot, where I'm saying the reason I'm approaching this interview in this way, and I'm asking these questions, I promise everyone I'm going to come to D, E, and F, but right now I'm focusing on this because I want to test the hypothesis that I have, which is this early thing that tends not to get talked about in the interviews when we're talking to, say, someone like Mark, actually was fundamental to this incremental, non-obvious compounding that then led to a book that sold 50 million copies. And because I wish someone had done that for me earlier,
That's so lovely. I feel like I do that out of insecurity. Like, hey, don't think I'm an idiot for not asking the thing that you think I should be asking.
I'm sure I do that too.
Explaining why I'm asking all these other things first.
Yeah,
so
I'm sure I do that too. Yeah. I'm sure I do that too. Or I'll be very personally interested in someone's ability or background with, like, I'm making this up, like Olympic archery. And I know it's like 1 out of every 10,000 people listening even knows what I'm talking about, but I'm deeply interested. So I'm like, sorry guys, this is just for me right now for the next 10 minutes. So if you're not interested in Olympic archery, like fast forward.
That was what I said to you at the top of this. I'm like, there's so much, and we're going to wrap this up because we're at 2 hours, but I could go for 6 hours. So I'm like, there's so many things that I would love to like go deeper, but I think this was great. I really wanted to talk about how you are thinking about NFTs now. I feel like people got a really good sense of that. The good, the bad, the ugly, everything in between. Hopefully folks feel like they have a sense of how much, work and attention you put into everything you do, including Cock Punch. And I joked earlier, of course, I listened to the podcast and know about what you're doing on the story side of this, in part because I want to be really researched for a conversation like this, but I've also been listening to it and I've really enjoyed it. So folks should go check it out. They should go check out what you're doing broadly and study it. I think it's fascinating. And Tim, thank you so much for joining Overpriced JPEGs.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me. And also, you mentioned to me, I don't know if it was before we started recording, but you were like, I'm not really a fantasy person. For anybody who feels that way, I would say, if you're a human, you're a storytelling person, no matter what, right? Mm-hmm. So there are a couple of I think, layups in the world of fantasy, and those would include The Wizard of Earthsea by Ursula K. Le Guin.
Okay.
The Wizard of Earthsea is one. Yeah, without that, there is no Harry Potter. In terms of wizarding schools, it had a huge impact. And Ursula is fascinating because she was a genre-busting, award-winning writer at the highest level in both sci-fi and fantasy as a woman many, many decades ago, when that just was not a thing. And she is an incredible writer. She's very, very good. So The Wizard of Earthsea would be one. The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss would be another one.
Yes. My friend who's very into fantasy gifts me that book probably once a year to be like, this is going to be the year you're going to read The Name of the Wind.
It's spectacular. It's spectacular. And, I have little nods throughout Cock Punch also to a lot of the authors and worlds and influences that I've had over many decades. And The Name of the Wind is a spectacular book. So I recommend people take a look at that. There are many others. I mean, I think Tolkien is hard to digest for a lot of folks, but so much of what we take for granted is in terms of the archetypes that we find in, say, Dungeons and Dragons, is largely informed by Tolkien. I would say also, maybe you can consider this fantasy, The Graveyard Book, more contemporary, by Neil Gaiman.
I've read that. I listened to that, funny enough, because I mean it when I say I've been enjoying your podcast, but it is sometimes hard to keep names when they're kind of abstract fantasy names. Sure. So I am excited when you someday publish the written kind. But I listened to the Graveyard Book. And
the ensemble cast is good, but if you're going to listen to it, which I did, I suggest listening to Neil Gaiman's narration. So that's like the starter kit for people who might want to explore fantasy at a high level. You know what vibe I a little bit got in your podcast that I haven't heard you reference in any of the other things, and maybe you think I'm totally off base, and maybe it's just about the first one and the Scribe and talking about the Scribe, but was The Giver. Mm-hmm. Have you read The Giver? No, I haven't read The Giver. Oh my gosh, I'm surprised. Who is it by? That's like a book you read sometimes, like fifth grade, I feel like classes have you read The Giver. Lois Lowry. Oh, wow. I wouldn't even be able to easily articulate to you why I was getting those vibes, but like that was and I love that book. It's actually a really interesting, you'd probably enjoy it. I mean, it's definitely still feels like adults can read it or kids can read it, but yeah. There's a lot out there. I mean, The Neverending Story was the one that kicked it all off for me. Simultaneously, The Neverending Story and then playing a lot of D&D as a kid, which is an incredibly complex game. But another one I'll just mention for folks, if they've already read everything I mentioned, if you haven't read The Lies of Locke Lamora by Scott Lynch, so good and so funny. I mean, really an outstanding book, and then the follow-up books are also really, really good. I found them to be a lot of fun. So those are a few places people can start. Okay, well, then finally, if we're doing book things, I have two quick things. One, you mentioned Die with Zero as a book that you maybe haven't read yet, but are thinking of reading. A bunch of people have recommended. I recently finished it, yeah. So you mentioned during the random show with Kevin. Mm-hmm. Yes, and what's so funny is my fiance recently read
die with zero. And it made me think of the 4-hour work week. I was like, you know, my introduction to that concept was like, yeah, why are we just going to live our lives and then like so that we can be rich at 65 or rich-ish at 60? Like what? It was funny to me to hear you mention that. And I was like, oh, I feel like I knew the concepts because of you.
Yeah. There's a lot of overlap. There's definitely a lot of overlap. And there were a few, I thought, very helpful concepts in terms of thinking of your, say, peak physical capacity and bucketing the experiences you want to have based on your physical capacity and sort of maybe pushing off some of the things that you will be able to do or should be able to do in your 70s and 80s, and then front loading the more aggressive stuff and ensuring that you get those in the calendar. And there's a lot more to the book. But I did finish that one. You said you had 2, so that was one.
Well, the second was, I know you love because you've had him on the podcast, I think multiple times, is The War of Art by Stephen Pressfield. And I recommend that on my podcast all the time. Pressfield? Did I get that
Pressfield.
right?
Yeah, you got it. Yep.
That I just feel like that is the ultimate book for anybody who's got a creative itch. Is like, read that book.
Yeah, you're going to get in your own way, so you might as well have some tools for getting out of your own way. So the War of Art is good for that. Yeah, the War of Art is good for that. Mm-hmm.
Those are my recent Tim Ferriss book things that have popped up as I've listened to your show and listened to things. So, all right, totally. Tim, thank you so much. This was such a blast. I really appreciate how generous you are with your time and.
My pleasure.
And your copy editing feedback. Generous with both.
I love that you mentioned that because, you know, it's people either love it or they hate it. I am the kind of person who, like, I just study a lot of languages. I do a lot of writing. If something, I want people to give me that kind of feedback. So hopefully that wasn't too weird.
No, I love it. It's actually funny. This doesn't reflect any better on me as a quote unquote project founder, but I hadn't actually reviewed. I'd looked at all the internal pages that we were going over, and I usually am pretty good also at like things will jump out when things are missing, or I'm usually the one reading the website being like, they put 2 extra spaces. Nobody else notices this, but they haven't been doing that throughout the rest of the document. Why did they do it? Anyway, all right, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much for watching this episode of Overpriced JPEGs. If you liked this conversation, if you liked this episode, please go ahead and hit subscribe. It helps me out, it helps the show out, and it means you will get alerts and updates when we post new content. Thanks again.